what point does BDSM and kink cross the line into too far? Is it when one person stops consenting? But some people don't know when to stop, and they find themselves consenting until it eventually kills them. So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about a notorious case from Ireland, the murder of Elaine O'Hara. And if you're from Ireland, then you fully understand why I'm about to say this, but this case is going to be a two-parter. There is a lot for us to get through here. So this is part one. Part two will be out in the next few days, so make sure you're subscribed with my notifications on so that you don't miss that. But quickly, before we get into part one of this case, I do just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Word Farm Adventure. Word Farm Adventure is a free to download mobile game available on both iOS and on Android, so if you want to download it, there's a link down below in the description. It's basically a word game app, so there's crossword puzzles, there's complete the word Scrabble missions. It's a really fun game to get your brain going and ultimately improve your vocabulary at the same time. But there's also a really cool design element to Word Farm Adventure that I love, where you get to restore and decorate your own farm and a villa. You can make it however you want, and the more levels that you complete in the game, the more bits you unlock to change and decorate about your place. It's such a unique game. I've never found a game that combines design and like decorating your house with word games. I've been playing this game for over a year now. I've talked about this on my channel before, and if anything, if it's even possible, I like it even more now because they've released so many more features and new things. One of the things that I absolutely love about the game now is that you can change your tiles. So right now I've got these really cool like galaxy tiles on. I change them all the time. I love it. They've got so many cool ones. They've got one that looks like candy floss and I want that one next. I love the game and I'm sure that you guys will too. So if you want to download Word Farm Adventure, you can click the link down below in the description. Remember, it is free to download. And if you do download the game through that link down below, then you'll get a welcome bonus. So don't say I don't treat you around here. Thanks again to Word Farm Adventure for sponsoring this video. Now before we get into it, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Now there's a lot of content warnings for this one because this is a very, very dark and layered case. There's so many layers to this one. So if any of the following themes are things that you don't think you can listen to right now, please do click out and look after yourself before you watch any kind of true crime content. But the themes are as follows: domestic abuse, self-harm, suicide attempts, rape, manipulation and exploitation of a vulnerable person. And I don't really know how to word this bit, but we're going to be talking a lot about BDSM and kink, but not all of it is consensual for both parties. So if that's triggering at all, then please, like I said, click out of this video and look after yourself. I'm sure I'll catch you again another time with a different video. I also wanted to make like a teeny tiny little disclaimer here as well, that this video is not meant to bash BDSM communities at all. Maybe just some select few horrible people that find themselves within those communities that abuse people's trust and consent and stuff like that. So anyway, Elaine O'Hara was a 36-year-old childcare worker from Dublin, Ireland. She was born on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th of 1976, and she was the first child to Frank and Eileen O'Hara. They lived in a place called Killiney in South Dublin, which is quite an upper middle class seaside town, and overall Elaine had a very happy, nice upbringing. She was quite close with her parents growing up, particularly her father, Frank. She was very much a daddy's girl, and he was like her #1 fan. He would always remind her how talented and strong and amazing and beautiful she was. He would always like fill her confidence as high as it'll go. And their relationship was so strong that it didn't weaken at all as Elaine like grew up into a teenager and then into an adult. They were still just as close when Elaine was a fully grown woman as they were when she was young. Elaine was a very loving, caring, nurturing person. She had a real maternal streak in her. She adored children. She was really good with them, particularly her goddaughter. And she never had children herself, but she always said that she wanted them. She always wanted to be a mother. She felt like a bit of a calling to it, I suppose. But that's kind of skipping ahead a little bit. Let's go back to Elaine's childhood. So as she was growing up, her mother was a primary school teacher, and Elaine would watch her and think, wow, that's such a good job to have. And she knew that when she grew up, she wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps and work with children, ideally as a primary school teacher, but just failing that, she just wanted to work with children. Overall, Elaine had a very, very happy childhood, but the only issue that she did have was when she was diagnosed with very severe dyslexia. And this dyslexia was so severe that it actually affected the way that she pronounced a lot of words. And this made Elaine quite insecure from time to time. She didn't like talking to new people just in case it happened, like a word came out wrong. But like I said, overall, her childhood was just very normal and very happy. That was until she got to high school, and Elaine had a really, really hard time in high school. She was relentlessly bullied by her classmates, and I don't know particularly what for, but Elaine actually never told anyone about this bullying. She didn't tell teachers, parents, anyone. She just suffered in silence with it. And she was growing very, very depressed behind the scenes, but again, she kept this brave face. She never wanted to tell anyone that she was struggling or that she was having a hard time. And over time, this was really grating on her. And then when she was 15 years old, Elaine O'Hara's world was shattered when her best friend was killed in a car accident. And as I'm sure you can imagine, when her mental health is already very much struggling, she's in a very hard time at the moment, and then this happens on top of that, she just absolutely broke down. When she was 15 years old, she started to self-harm, and then when she was 16 years old, Elaine was actually sent to the hospital when her mother walked into the bathroom and found her daughter laying on the ground after a suicide attempt. Before Elaine was allowed to leave the hospital, she had to be seen by a psychiatrist, of course, to make sure that she is feeling okay and she doesn't try to do this again. And this psychiatrist, when they were assessing Elaine, they kind of struggled to know what to diagnose her with. They eventually settled on two things: recurring depression disorder and borderline personality disorder. He also noted on her record, this isn't anything to do with the diagnosis, just more of a note about Elaine's character, that she was a very vulnerable person and that she had quite a submissive personality. She let people walk all over her quite a bit. On her release from hospital, Elaine was on what has been described as a cocktail of antidepressants and tranquilizers, and she was on them for the rest of her teenage years. And she wasn't really herself when she was on this medication at all. It just kind of sucked all the feeling and emotion and energy out of her. She was just quite a zombie. She was just tired all the time. She had no, she was just very numb inside. She couldn't find things funny. She was like a zombie. That's the best way I can find to describe this. And the medication made her so drowsy as well that her parents even remember taking her out for a meal one time, and Elaine was literally falling asleep at the table because she was so exhausted on these medications. Elaine only just scraped by completing her leaving cert, which is, it's the exam at the end of school in Ireland, kind of like GCSEs in England. But like I said, she only just passed, so she didn't quite get the grades that she needed to go on and become a primary school teacher, but she was gonna try and find a way. Instead, she went on to become a daycare worker, which is still working with children, although it's not the primary school teacher job she originally wanted, and it didn't pay as well as the primary school teacher job. It was still a job in a field that she enjoyed, so she was happy. Although because the job didn't pay very well at all, Elaine actually had to pick up a second job, a part-time job at a newsagent's, just to make ends meet. So the kind of person that Elaine O'Hara was, I suppose I'll just reel off some facts about her. I've just got some facts here that I don't really know how to slip them into the story. So she was quite a quiet person. She didn't have a big social circle. She kept her social circle very much to a couple of friends, and then her family were mainly the people that she hung out with. She had asthma, but she also smoked heavily at the same time, which only made it even worse, and she struggled really badly with it, to be fair. Her physical fitness and stuff was really debilitated by it, and she was also diagnosed with diabetes at some point in her adult life. So she's got quite a lot of struggles coming from quite a lot of areas of her life, although the main struggle for Elaine was her mental health. That was the overarching thing in her life that was never right. It was always causing issues. It was always under the woodwork. In 2002, when Elaine was 26 years old, she received the devastating news that her mother had passed away. and this was enough to knock her already very fragile mental state to the point where she ended up in hospital again. In her therapy sessions at this particular time, Elaine wanted to discuss two things in particular. The first thing was her depression. She would discuss feelings of low mood and self-hatred, feelings of worthlessness. But then there was also something else that she wanted to talk about with her therapist, and that was that Elaine said that she had fantasies about being restrained and imprisoned. And this wasn't just a passing comment either, like she brought this up a couple of times in this therapy session. In fact, her doctor described it as obsessional. So I don't really know how she was talking about it, but it sounds a bit mad. Over the rest of her 20s and into her 30s, Elaine O'Hara went on to attempt suicide numerous times throughout the years, one of which was actually on her birthday. Her and all of her family had been out that night for her birthday. I think they'd gone to like a restaurant for a meal or something like that. And at one point, Elaine and her father got into an argument, a very quite serious argument, and it upset Elaine so much that she left. She left her own birthday celebrations. So her family just let her calm down for a minute, and then her sister went to go and check on her. But when she walked into Elaine's apartment, she found her laying on the ground, passed out, after taking an overdose. After each of these suicide attempts all the way through her 20s and 30s, she would get little bits of help here and there, like she'd be offered hospital stays or therapy sessions, psychiatrist assessments and stuff, but none of it really helped, like, at all. Elaine's mental health really was just one long, horrific struggle for her. It was so heartbreaking reading up on certain parts of this case because you can just see how badly she suffered, and for so long as well. For like decades, this woman was so depressed and so down, and I just wish I could give her a hug. And then in 2007, Elaine faced quite a significant setback once again when her psychiatrist that she'd been seeing for the last 16 years passed away. And this just tore Elaine apart. As I'm sure you can imagine, if you've ever had like a long-term psychiatrist or therapist, you put so much trust into that person and you depend on them. Like, you literally go to them to help your mental state because you are in a bad position. So to lose that person as well, like, I can't imagine what that would have done to her brain. Eventually, Elaine did get another therapist, and this therapist decided to go about things a little bit differently with Elaine, since clearly what she was doing at the time wasn't working. She was still very depressed. So with the help of this new therapist, Elaine started to reduce her medication dose. He thought she was on something way too strong. But he also started her on CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and she was responding really well to this at first. She was starting to feel good for the first time in years. But unfortunately, that happiness wouldn't last long for Elaine O'Hara, because in the summer of 2012, everything just came crashing in on her all at once. Her apartment flooded, she was falling behind on her mortgage payments, she was anxious because she had this test coming up for because she still wanted to be a primary school teacher, so she was still doing courses outside of her work so that she could, anyway, she had a test for that and she was anxious about it. There was so much going wrong in her life all at once that Elaine just broke down, and for the first time in years, she was actually contemplating suicide again. But these thoughts really, really scared her. Like, she'd been doing so well for so long. Like, it had been a good few years now that she hadn't been feeling like this. And as soon as she felt those feelings creep back in, it terrified her. And she wanted to nip it in the bud then and there so it wouldn't get worse. So the following morning, Elaine O'Hara marched down to the hospital and admitted herself for some psychiatric help because she felt like this was only going to get worse if she had to deal with it alone. This was actually now her 14th stay at this one particular hospital. She'd been there a lot because, like I said, she had so many different suicide attempts. They kept her there after each different one to assess her and make sure she was okay. Some of the hospital stays were voluntary. When she could feel herself getting bad again, she would admit herself so that she wouldn't get to the point of a suicide attempt. She really was trying to help herself, was Elaine O'Hara, and I just have so much sympathy for her. You watch her try so hard, and somehow something always keeps happening that just pushes her back a step and back another step. In her first assessment of this hospital stay, Elaine told the psychiatrist that she was feeling very lonely, very isolated from the world. And this psychiatrist actually made the same note on file to say that Elaine kept talking about her dark sexual fantasies. It seemed that Elaine mentioned these fantasies, these sexual fantasies in therapy quite often, and I wonder why that is. Like, I wonder if she wasn't happy with the fact that she was having them and she was trying to like fix them maybe. I don't know why else you would bring that up to a psychiatrist unless it was for context, but if one of them described it as obsessional, it feels like it's something that she is really bothered about, maybe. So anyway, Elaine is now full-time in the hospital because staff need to keep an eye on her and check her progress and stuff, but they did allow her to keep her part-time job at the newsagents, and they let her go out every weekend to keep that job just so that she had that like normality, you know? Elaine was finally discharged from hospital for the last time on August 22nd, 2012, and the staff described her as being very upbeat. She was quite excited for, you know, going back out to freedom. She was actually due to volunteer at a festival in Dublin City the next day, and she was super excited for it. She'd applied to volunteer months and months ago, and she'd been accepted, and she'd been like counting down the days until this festival, and it was finally here tomorrow. She'd been discharged just in time. She was chewing everyone's ear off in the hospital the whole time she was in there, talking about this festival that she was gonna go and work at. She was dead excited. So she was let out of hospital in the morning, so she had the whole day ahead of her. At about 1:30 p.m, she met up with her father, Frank, and they walked to her mother's grave and put some flowers down, paid their respects. But Frank noticed that Elaine was more glued to her phone than usual on this day. Like, she was constantly receiving texts and responding to them while they were at her mother's grave, and Frank was getting a little bit annoyed. He was like, come on, put your phone down. After they went to the cemetery, they went back to Frank's house to go and see Elaine's goddaughter, who was round at his, and Elaine actually gave her a friendship bracelet that she'd made for her goddaughter. They had a really nice special bond. Maybe it was the other way around, actually. Maybe the goddaughter gave Elaine the friendship bracelet. I really don't know. I just don't know. Anyway, Elaine was there at her father's until about 4 p.m. that day, when she said that she was going to head home and get an early night because she had that festival tomorrow and she wasn't going to miss it for anything. She wanted to make sure that she was well rested and in ship shape for this festival. She had to be there super early, by like 8 a.m, and so she arranged to get a lift with her father's girlfriend named Sheila. Sheila lived opposite Elaine, like they lived in apartment buildings opposite each other, so it made sense. If Sheila was heading that way, then she might as well take Elaine. Later that night, Sheila texted Elaine saying, see you at 7:15 a.m, just to remind her of the time, but she never received a response. She didn't think too much into it at the time. She just thought that maybe Elaine was already in bed. After all, she was getting a mega early night. The next morning, Sheila woke up and she waited for Elaine to make her way across to her house for a lift. But she was late, and so Sheila was waiting, and then she couldn't wait any longer. She decided to get up and go over to Elaine's apartment building and see what the hell was going on. So Sheila arrived, she rang the doorbell and waited, but Elaine didn't come to the door, and so she got out her phone and she decided to just call her. Maybe Elaine was still in bed, maybe she'd slept in. She was hoping that maybe if her knocking couldn't wake her up, then maybe this phone call would, but Elaine didn't pick up this phone call. So at this point, Sheila doesn't really know what to do. I mean, she knew how much this festival meant to Elaine as well. She knew she wouldn't have wanted to miss it or be late or sleep in or whatever. So Sheila just starts banging on the door like hellfire. She was thinking, well, failing everything else, if she is asleep in there, banging is gonna wake her up, surely. But it didn't work. Elaine didn't come to the door. And so Sheila starts thinking, well, has she already left? So Sheila rang Frank, Elaine's father, and just told him the situation, and he found it really weird as well. He tried to ring her, again, no response. He jokingly texted her saying, are you alive? Again, no response. Frank thought there must be an explanation for this, and so he just gave his daughter some time to either wake up or return their texts and phone calls. He didn't want to bombard her too much. She's a grown woman, after all. But after a few hours, Elaine still hadn't got in contact with anyone. She hadn't returned anyone's calls or texts, and now Frank was worried. So he went round to her apartment and let himself in with a spare key that he had. He walked inside and immediately everything seems very normal. And then he looks at the kitchen counter and he sees Elaine's iPhone is on the side, still on charge. Now, already this was a bit odd because Elaine would never leave the house without her phone like most people. Most people don't leave their phone in the house all day charging, because that's why you got a phone, is to take it out with you. And she was very much one of those people that was always kind of glued to her phone. It was always in her pocket or always in her hand. She was never without it. So this was weird. But there was nothing else off about her apartment, like, at all. Her father walked around the whole thing. Nothing was out of place or missing or anything. The house just seemed as if Elaine had walked out and left. In the meantime, Sheila had actually ran down to Elaine's building's car park to check if Elaine's car was there, and it wasn't. Now, this made a lot of sense. Maybe she'd gone in her own car to the festival. Maybe she'd just woken up late, realised how late she was, and then just jumped in her car and sped herself off to the festival. That would also explain her leaving her phone behind in a rush, maybe. Frank and Sheila just assumed that Elaine must be at the festival. She must have made it there somehow, probably in her own car. And so they just moved on with their day. They just expected to speak to her later and hear all about this festival that she managed to get to eventually. But the next morning, Sheila swung by Elaine's apartment just to ask her about the festival because she was so excited. But again, Elaine didn't come to the door. Now, this was very concerning. Elaine hadn't been home in 2 days now. So Frank and Sheila are trying to think of all the different places that she could be. And that's when Frank got the idea. What if Elaine had admitted herself into hospital again? Because she was in hospital a lot, like pretty much once a year. So he rang up the hospital, but they said that Elaine hadn't been admitted again. They had no idea where she was. So now Frank decided to call the festival and try and speak to like a manager or someone that was working at the event and ask them if Elaine ever turned up for her shift. And they said that she hadn't. She'd never made it to the festival. So Frank and Sheila are now realising that no one has heard from Elaine O'Hara in over 2 days, and they were really worried that she might have actually tried to or maybe successfully taken her life. So with that thought in mind, they rushed straight down to the police station to go and report Elaine O'Hara as missing. And obviously because of her past and her previous suicide attempts, mental health issues, this case was of top priority. That night, the police, along with all of Elaine's family, they were driving to all the different places that Elaine used to go. All her favourite cafes, shops, parks, all that kind of stuff. Her brother-in-law even jumped in his car and drove down to the cemetery where her mother's grave was, just in case she'd gone there to see her mother. But it was as he was pulling into this cemetery that he looked into the car park and saw Elaine's car. A blue Fiat. It was just parked there in this car park. So her brother called the police, who came straight down. They wanted to search Elaine's car to see if there were any clues to her whereabouts. There weren't. All they found was a lighter, 2 different packs of cigarettes, and a phone charger that wasn't for an iPhone. And Elaine only had an iPhone. And later that same evening, a search was also conducted at Elaine's apartment, and it was in this search that the police learnt a lot more about Elaine O'Hara than they expected to. As they were looking through all of her stuff, they found Elaine O'Hara's sex drawer. And, you know, a lot of adults have a sex drawer where they keep sex stuff, sex toys, whatever. But Elaine's was a little bit mad. And I'm not saying any of this to shame her, by the way. If you think I'm like laughing at her, I'm not. I just think this is like, it's quite a giggle-worthy topic, isn't it? You know? So in Elaine's sex drawer, they found rope, a PVC bodysuit, they found handcuffs, big, thick, heavy metal chains, a gas mask, question mark? There was loads more than just that as well, but we'll move on. They also found a notebook that had a couple of notes, like right at the end, where she'd clearly just like opened it, scribbled something, and then forgotten about it. And this note that was towards the end in this book, it was a bunch of different fetish websites. They also found a document on Elaine's laptop that was called The Gorian Lifestyle, A Woman's Right is Slave. And this document is basically about the domination and enslavement of women by men. This document believes that women only exist to please men, they're sexual objects, all that kind of stuff. So police had just found all this stuff about Elaine, and they took it back to her family and they were like, do you know anything about this? Like, can you Can you tell us anything about this? But honestly, they were just as surprised as police. They had no idea that Elaine had this side to her, which, you know, you probably don't talk about that kind of stuff with your parents that much. But like, they had no idea. Definitely couldn't get my words out for a minute. But she'd never even like hinted towards it with them or anything like that. Like they had no idea. But anyway, moving on. Police's next job in this case was to collect all of the CCTV footage from the outside of Elaine's building. Obviously, if they look through enough hours of this footage, they will see Elaine leaving her apartment for the last time, and maybe there's some sort of clues in that. Maybe she's leaving in a rush, or maybe she's with someone. This footage catches Elaine leaving her apartment for the last time at 5 p.m. on the 22nd of August. So the day that she was last seen, this was the day before she was even discovered missing. So she'd actually been gone 3 days, not 2. She went missing the same night that she was discharged from hospital. Elaine didn't seem like she was panicked or in a hurry or, you know, whatever. She looked like she was just walking normal. But there was one interesting thing about this footage, and that was that she seemed to be holding a phone in her hand. But if you remember, her phone was left on charge in her kitchen. So police tried to clear up this footage a little bit. They kind of zoomed in. And that was when they realised that this phone was not an iPhone. It wasn't Elaine's phone. So whose was it and why was she carrying it? Could it have even been her phone? Could she have had 2 phones? But then what would the purpose of that be? I suppose it's all part of the investigation. So again, the police went and asked her friends and family. They were like, do you know anything about this? Do you know why she might have 2 phones or why she might have someone else's phone? And again, her family were like, I don't know. I just don't know. Her family and friends were equally as baffled as the police at every stage during this investigation, because it seemed that Elaine O'Hara had a lot more beneath the surface than what she let people see. You'll see it throughout the case, throughout both parts. You learn more things about this woman as you go. But anyway, the investigation continued on. The next thing that police did was they went down to the area where her car was found and they had a search around there, because surely that means something. She parked in that area. So the place where she'd parked, like I said, it was the cemetery car park, but it wasn't just the cemetery's car park. So the cemetery was part of a much larger park called Shanganar Park. Maybe. I didn't sound too confident, and that's because I'm not. So there was this big park, and then there was the cemetery connected to it, Shanganar Cemetery, and then at the back of the park there was like a beach, but it was quite a small beach. It was more cliffs than it was like a beach, you know? But anyway, this whole thing was Shanganar Park, and that car park was for the whole thing. So they didn't know why Elaine was there, but the main believed theory was that she was going to the cemetery, probably to go and see her mother's grave. So the police went down to Shanganar Park because it's very much a place where locals go, and there's regulars like dog walkers, joggers, stuff like that. So police went down to Shanganar Park to see if they could talk to some people, see if anyone might have been there on the 22nd of August and maybe seen Elaine. And this one particular man named Connor, he used to go jogging there every single day. He told police that he thinks he spoke with Elaine O'Hara. He put it at around 5:40 p.m. that night, so the timings line up. So he was just on his jog as normal that day when he said that Elaine flagged him down. So he stopped running and she asked him for directions to a footbridge that went over a local railway line. And so he gave her these directions and she went off on her way. Connor said that during this interaction, Elaine seemed very distant and spaced out, and like she wasn't really there. She didn't say thank you when he gave her the directions. She literally just like turned and walked away, which he thought was really weird. Later on in his jog, Connor actually went down to that footbridge. He jogged over the footbridge and he saw Elaine while he was there. And he thought to himself in his head, oh, should I say something about like, oh, you've found the bridge, you know? But then ultimately he decided not to say anything to Elaine after their last interaction. He didn't feel like he really wanted to talk. So this man, Connor, was the last person to ever see Elaine O'Hara. And while it was useful information, it didn't really give them any leads as to where she was. And so right now, the investigation was actually losing momentum. It was getting slower and slower by the day. Months went by and Elaine still hadn't contacted anyone. She hadn't returned home. There were no leads in this case. None of her things were turning up anywhere. Like, it was like she disappeared into thin air. Right now, police were running out of options. They'd exhaust every lead that they had at the time, and that was when one police officer proposed a theory. So based on the evidence, we know that Elaine O'Hara went to Shanganagh Cemetery on the day that she disappeared. In fact, there was one passerby in the cemetery that day that told police they'd seen a woman of Elaine's description crying loudly by an old gravestone. So this detective that proposed the theory said, well, what if Elaine O'Hara went to her mother's grave to go and say goodbye, and then maybe she walked to the beach at the back of Shanganagh Park where all those cliffs are, and maybe she took her own life there. It would make sense. Maybe she was saying goodbye to her mother one last time because she knew what she was about to do. And maybe that's why her car was still there. That's why no one's heard from her. There was the potential that her body could have just got washed out to sea. And that way they would never know if they were right. The next year in 2013, still no sign of Elaine O'Hara, and her case was officially categorised as a cold case. Everyone just accepted the suicide theory because it seemed very, very likely. Like, even the evidence seemed to support it, that her car was there. And when Elaine has attempted suicide so many times in her life, it is very believable. And her family were just left with no definitive answers, just a theory. And they just had to get on with their lives as if nothing had happened, as if their loved one hadn't just disappeared with no trace. But then on September 10th, 2013, so this is over a year after her disappearance, 3 men went out on a walk to a reservoir together. They walked around the whole thing, and then they went and stood on this bridge, this like footbridge that stood over the water, so they could look down and watch the water flow by. And then halfway through this conversation, one of these men is looking down at the water and he sees something shiny. And it piques his interest, as it would any human being. And he suddenly gets so determined, he wants to fish this shiny thing out and see what it is. He's so curious to know what this thing is in the reservoir, so he decides to go back to his van, grab some kind of tool, whatever he had, this massive pole, and bring it back so that he could fish this shiny thing out of the reservoir. So the men shove this big stick thing in the water and they're like wading it around, and they found a few things before they got to the shiny thing. They found a white women's vest, they found a blue hoodie, and then they finally catch this shiny thing that they've had their eye on. But as they go to pull it out of the water, my God, they were not prepared for what this shiny thing really was. Out came this big tangled mess of chains, and so they pulled it over onto the bridge and they start separating them all, and as they do, they realise that this was 2 sets of handcuffs, 2 sets of leg restraints, and a mask with a ball gag. So the men are all laughing and joking to each other about what they've just found, and one of them even jokingly says to the other, oh, we better stop fishing stuff out of here, we don't know what we're gonna find next. The men put all the items on the wall of the bridge and just left them there in case anyone came to claim them. Obviously they didn't want them, they weren't going to take them home. So they just left them on the wall and then they went on their way. They just carried on with their day as normal. But there was one man in this group, his name was Billy, and he just could not stop thinking about what they'd found all day. Like, it was just playing on his mind. He just couldn't shake the feeling that what if there was a sinister backstory to why all of these items had been ditched in a reservoir? You know, it doesn't seem quite right. He spent the whole night thinking about it, and then he woke up the next morning and he still couldn't get them off his mind, and that was when he knew he had to do something about this. So he went down to the reservoir. All the things were still on the wall of the bridge like they'd left them, so this man grabs all the items and he took them to the police station, and the police told him he did the right thing bringing them in. They took them off him, put them to dry out, and then they were going to just submit them as like potential evidence for something maybe one day. So Billy left the police station and he felt like this weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. But it seems that that weight had just been put back down on someone else's shoulders, because now the police officer that took the evidence in, he did exactly the same as what Billy had done the night before. He couldn't stop thinking about why these things were ditched in a reservoir. It doesn't seem right. And so the next morning, this police officer wakes up and he's like, right, I want to go down to that reservoir myself. I need to have a look. I need to search for more things maybe. So the officer went down to this reservoir, but when he got there, the water was just very muddy and murky that day. Like he couldn't see anything. You could barely even like see your hand if you just like put it in front of you. So he left and he just got on with some other work for the time being. He was planning on going back to the reservoir maybe the next day or the day after, but before he could, this case got some breaking news on September 13th, 2013. A woman had taken her dogs for a walk that morning along the mountains in South Dublin, and this walk had gone absolutely fine. She did this same walk pretty much every single day with them, but it was as they returned to the car to go home that was when things started getting weird. As she was loading all the dogs into the back of her Jeep, one of them, named Millie, just turns around and runs off into the forest. And so this woman turns around and she's like shouting after it, Millie, come back, come back. But this dog was on a mission. It seemed like dead set on whatever it was running into that forest for. It must have heard something or smelt something. She tried to call the dog back. It didn't come back. And she had a feeling she knew what the dog was up to because Millie had done this a couple of times over the last couple of weeks as they'd been coming for walks. Every time that Millie would run off into this forest, she would return to the car with a bone in her mouth. And, you know, the dog owner would always take it off her, thinking it was like an animal bone. You don't know what kind of diseases are on it, you know? So the woman finishes putting the rest of the dogs in the Jeep anyway, and she's still calling for Millie this whole time, but she doesn't come back. And this was quite unlike Millie, so the woman decided to just go and walk into the forest and try and find her dog. And that was when she spotted her. In a clearing was Millie chewing on something. And as this woman got closer, she realized that the thing Millie was chewing on was yet another bone, but this time it was really big, bigger than any of the other bones she'd brought over. And that was when this woman turned her head to the side slightly and noticed a pair of blue tracksuit bottoms laying in the woods, right by where her dog was chewing on a really big bone. And that was when it clicked in her head. What if that's a human leg bone that her dog is chewing on? Could these have been human bones that her dog had been finding and bringing back to her for weeks? So this woman's panicking at this point. She knocked the bone out of Millie's mouth and then grabbed Millie and ran her back to the Jeep. When she got back to the car, she called the landowner, the guy that kind of maintains all the forests and stuff at Shanganagh Park, and she told him what she'd found. So the guy on the phone said, all right, wait there a minute, I'm gonna come down, I'll meet you. So he came down and this woman walks him out to these bones that she found, and at first the landowner's like, nah, they're just animal bones. Like, look, that one's got fur on it. He thought he could see fur on them. And that was when he spotted one more bone that couldn't possibly be an animal bone, because it was the lower part of a human jaw with teeth still in it. So this pretty much confirmed that what they were looking at had to be human remains. So immediately they called the police rushed down. It was very clear that these remains had been decomposing in this forest for a long, long time. Like, there was barely anything left on them. They were clean bones. And that also meant that it would be very, very hard to identify who these human remains even belonged to, because there's nothing to even identify. So what was left of these human remains was picked up and taken to a lab where they were hopefully gonna try and find out who it was. It turned out that the bones that Millie had found and brought back to her owner over the last few weeks had been a tibia, a fibula, and a humerus. So that's 2 lower leg bones and 1 upper arm bone. And as soon as the media found out about this discovery, that there were human remains in Shanganagh Park, oh my god, they went mental. They went mental. They were even like suggesting who it could be in their articles. Because in the 1990s, there were actually quite a few women that went missing in this general area, in like the Dublin mountains. The media believed specifically that it could have been a young woman named Annie McCarrick, because she actually disappeared quite close to where these bones were found. So anyway, this autopsy, if you can even call it an autopsy when it's just bones, whatever, it was underway. So they could determine a few things from these bones: that the victim was female, she was probably between the ages of 27 and 40, and that she'd probably been dead for about a year. So pathologists shared what little information they had with the police, and they took it and compared it to all of their missing persons cases. And that was when one name in particular jumped out at the police: Elaine O'Hara. Because she was 36 years old, she'd been missing for over a year now, she matched all the criteria. And obviously, knowing that they had a partial jawbone and some teeth, police rushed to go and get Elaine O'Hara's dental records. They brought them back and compared them, and it was confirmed that these were the remains of Elaine O'Hara. Less than 2/3 of Elaine's body were actually recovered in the end. The rest of it has never been found. I think her skull, her hands. But police didn't think this was too significant. They thought that maybe just animals had gotten to her or something like that. So anyway, as all of this identification process had been going on, remember I told you about that officer that went down to the reservoir to go and try and check for himself, see if there was anything in there, but the water was too muddy, so he couldn't. Well, finally, he'd managed to go back to the reservoir on a day where the water was a little bit clearer, and he found quite a lot of stuff. He found a leather mask, more handcuffs, more rope, a set of keys, an inhaler, and a kitchen knife. So a very ominous collection of things. But the item police were the most interested in wasn't actually the knife, or the mask, or the handcuffs. It was that set of keys. And that's because on these keys, there was a little keychain of a mini loyalty card for a supermarket chain in Ireland. And as soon as police saw this, they knew it was a golden ticket to an identification. All it would take was one call to a customer service department at that supermarket, and they would be able to figure out whose keys these were. And that would be huge for the investigation, because then they would understand more about this plethora of items. And later that evening, when police made that call, they had their answer. This loyalty card and these keys belonged to Elaine O'Hara. And this put a whole new spin on this case. How and why had Elaine's car keys been ditched in a reservoir along with loads of fetish paraphernalia? And a knife as well, and a literal knife. It seemed that whoever had been involved in Elaine's death was definitely trying to get rid of some stuff. But who was that person? Because it was very clear now that Elaine hadn't taken her own life. So who had? Police knew that this was going to be one hell of a case to crack, especially when they don't even have Elaine's body. They don't even know her cause of death right now. So police decided that they needed to search that reservoir more, because every time they go in there looking for stuff, they find something else that's important in the investigation. So they cordoned the whole thing off, they sent in diving teams, and they found a lot of stuff again. This time they found a Nokia phone, 2 SIM cards, more sex toys, more handcuffs, some glasses, and a rucksack. And while they were on a roll with these searches, they decided to conduct another search of Elaine's apartment, just in case they missed any clues the first time. And again, it was seeming like they weren't going to find anything in her apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing seemed weird. But then one police officer starts going like above and beyond in this search, and I love him for it. He decides to just start like moving furniture. He's like picking up her stuff, looking under it, like moving her bed, stuff like that. He lifted up her mattress, and that was when he saw something. On the other side of that mattress were stab holes and blood stains on the bottom side of her mattress. So whoever had flipped this mattress had probably been trying to hide that. So this mattress was sent off to the lab so that they could take DNA samples, find out whose blood this was, and it was as they were doing that they actually realised that there was another DNA sample on this mattress. A semen sample. So they took a swab of that as well. They're trying to identify who all these samples belong to, and that's when they get the blood results back. It was Elaine O'Hara's blood. Although police didn't think that this was actually how she died. There didn't seem to be quite enough blood on the mattress for it to be like a murder scene, but it was clear that she had bled on this mattress at some point. Still very concerning. How and why did the blood get there? They then tested the semen sample against the database, but they found no match for it. Police knew they needed to identify some suspects first before this semen sample would be useful to them, because once they had some suspects, they could take a DNA sample from them, compare it to the semen swab, and then see if there's a match that way. But anyway, until then, they continued looking for clues, and at this point, they actually had Elaine's laptop and her phone back at the police station. The first thing they did was go on her history so that they could see what she was searching for in the days before her death, you know, who she was talking to, stuff like that. And that was when they realised that the main thing Elaine O'Hara used her laptop for was to go on fetish websites. I mean, we already knew that she used them based on her notebook. She'd scribbled a few names down, but now they realised that it was often, that was all she did. It seemed that she started going on these fetish websites back in 2006, so it had been 6 years now that she'd been part of this world. And the role that Elaine would take on for these websites and these conversations was that of a submissive, or a slave, as she liked to call herself. One of her accounts on these websites had the username Help Me Learn, and on her profile it said that she was looking for someone to train her to be the best submissive slave I can be. So anyway, from these websites, police managed to identify 8 different men that Elaine had had significant enough contact with through these websites. They got in contact with all 8 of these men. They asked for statements, interviews, all that kind of stuff. To be fair, a lot of them told the police that they stopped speaking with Elaine pretty quickly after they started, because they realized that she was into a lot more like hardcore stuff than they were. Like, she was into too much for them. But there were 2 profiles in particular that really stood out to police in this investigation, and they went by Architect 77 and Architect 72. It seemed like both accounts probably belonged to the same person, and this person had been in contact with Elaine O'Hara since 2007. They also found quite an interesting email in Elaine's inbox from 2008, so 4 years before her disappearance, and this email was from fetishboy@gmail.com. And it was a pretty long email, so I've just got one quote here for you. He said, "Always thinking of you. Anytime you want, I will gladly carry out what I promised to do." Fetishboy@gmail.com never identified himself in this email, although police did some digging and they found that the Architect 72 account was created with fetishboy@gmail.com email address. So they were the same person. As they continued searching through Elaine's laptop, they very quickly realised that a lot of files had actually been deleted. Now, don't know why this was. Maybe Elaine was trying to hide a lot of her interests in case anyone went on her laptop, because these are quite like outlandish things that we will be getting into in a second. So detectives used some specialist software to go and retrieve all these deleted files, and most of them were pornographic videos, which, you know, maybe she just didn't want anyone to find her stash. But then they found some next level stuff. They found this one particular document that was called Outline of Slave, and this was essentially a slavery contract that was created in September of 2010. I've got a big long quote from the contract right here, and I don't like to put massive quotes in my videos, but trust me, like, this is all interesting. I wish I could cut it down, but I can't, because it's all really interesting. So the quote says, "I am offering 24/7 sadistic, brutal treatment for a masochistic slave. Slaves are property, possession, meat. They are loved as a pet or cherished as a car. They are not a wife or a mistress. Slavery is a hard lifestyle to endure. You're not just a sex toy, but a complete package. You will be offered an annual slavery contract with no early release for any reason. You will either be kept in a heavy-duty cage or locked cell in my cellars. If you're good and collect merit awards, you will earn a real bed to sleep on." Kind of mad. A little bit mad. But anyway, there was another deleted document that was created in 2009. It was just titled Private, and in there it was just a short story about a woman being kidnapped and tortured. As they kept looking through her laptop, they found a collection of photos of Elaine O'Hara, a lot of them sexual in nature. Some of them she was naked, some of them she wasn't. But the ones where she wasn't wearing clothes, police realised that Elaine's body underneath her clothes was covered in scars. So police continued going, and then they stumbled across another 2 documents. Now, just a warning, these are the worst ones. There was one folder titled Read This, and it had loads of documents in there about how to target and kill people. There was another folder that was titled Killing, and this included loads of pictures of dead women. Police just couldn't believe what they were finding on Elaine O'Hara's laptop. Up until now, police had just thought she was this nice, normal woman, and now they were finding pictures of dead people on her laptop. And that is where I'm gonna finish part 1 of this case. Like I said, part 2 will be up in the next few days, so make sure you subscribed with notifications on so that you don't miss when the rest of the case is up. Thanks again to Word Farm Adventure for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you want to download the game, you can do so for free using the link down below in the description of this video. Huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. That would really help me out. If you want to subscribe, there's a link to do so right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, there's a link to do so here. And if you want to watch another true crime playlist, if you want to watch another true crime video, there'll be a playlist on screen, hopefully. Oh, bye! I forgot to say bye.